Tulsa, Oklahoma, a city where working-class neighborhoods sprawl across the eastern plains, where apartment complexes and taco trucks line the streets. But on one spring afternoon, 19-year-old Lalo Ledesma Jr. was young, hardworking, and eager to build a life for himself in America. To those who knew him, he was a quiet young man with a quick smile, someone who had traveled far from home to chase opportunity. He left behind his parents and two brothers in Mexico, crossing the border at 17 to work construction with his uncle. Friends knew him simply as Lalo, or sometimes by his other nickname, El Chino. He had an ex-girlfriend in town, acquaintances scattered across East Tulsa. He climbed into the backseat of a stranger's Ford Expedition, and he would never climb out alive. The following account is based on official police records, interrogation footage, surveillance video, and interviews with the detectives who worked this case. What you're about to hear is the story of a senseless murder, a killer who confessed with a smile, and the haunting words that still echo in the minds of everyone who heard them. I killed, and I will kill again. To understand what happened to Lalo, we need to go back to the night before his murder. The morning of the murder began with an errand. The driver had a bone to pick with someone. A young man who had sold him a computer 6 weeks earlier. The computer turned out to be password protected and completely useless. He'd paid good money for it, and he wanted that money back. By sheer coincidence, or perhaps by fate, the driver spotted the young man who had sold him the computer that very day. It was Lalo. The driver confronted him about the money he was owed, and Lalo, perhaps feeling guilty or simply wanting to make things right, agreed to help clean a house to work off the debt. And so sometime before noon, Lalo climbed into the back seat of the Ford Expedition. Juan was already in the passenger seat. The three of them, virtual strangers thrown together by circumstance, drove off to handle what should have been a simple task.
Who's deceased in the back seat?
They made a stop at a taco truck, one of those roadside stands that dot the streets of East Tulsa. The driver ordered food for everyone, shrimp tacos, by one account. But when he reached for his wallet, he realized he was short on cash. They left without their food, the tacos sitting unclaimed on the counter. It was such a mundane moment, such an ordinary frustration. No one could have known that Lalo had less than an hour to live. The driver pulled up to a house on Independence Street, a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. He needed to run inside for a moment to grab a bucket, he would later say, to wash his car. He left Juan and Lalo alone in the vehicle. What happened in those 6 minutes would haunt everyone who reviewed the surveillance footage. The camera mounted on a nearby building captured the Ford Expedition sitting motionless in the street. For 6 long minutes, nothing seemed amiss. The driver was inside the house. The truck sat there, still and silent. But inside that vehicle, something horrific was unfolding. Juan, the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere the night before, was attacking Lalo in the back seat. He was stabbing him not once, not twice, but dozens of times. 45 times, the medical examiner would later determine. 45 separate wounds inflicted in a frenzy of violence that defied explanation. 6 minutes later, the driver emerged from the house carrying a bucket. He walked back to his vehicle, opened the door, and discovered a nightmare. There was blood everywhere, arterial spray coating the interior, a young man's body slumped in the back seat. And Juan? Juan was standing there, covered in blood, as if waiting to see what would happen next. And then Juan, the killer, simply walks away. The camera shows him heading down the street, disappearing around a corner, wearing dark pants and a red hoodie, that distinctive cold sore, visible even in the grainy footage. He walked away like a man without a care in the world. The driver, shaken and terrified, did the only thing he could think to do. He called 911. When Tulsa police arrived at the scene, they found a crime that made even veteran detectives pause. The interior of the Ford Expedition was soaked in blood. The victim, still unidentified at this point, had been stabbed so many times that his throat was nearly destroyed. Detective Kennedy was one of the first on scene. He took one look at the carnage and knew this wasn't going to be a simple case.
I think this happened inside the vehicle. I just don't think it happened at that house.
He was right. The murder had occurred while the Expedition was parked on the street. The victim had no identification on him. His fingerprints came back with nothing, no matches in any database. As it stands right now, we have no clue who this individual is. Detective John Brown admitted as he wrapped up the initial crime scene investigation. Meanwhile, A statewide alert went out for the suspect, a Hispanic male, red hoodie, dark pants, cold sore on his lip, last seen heading toward Utica on Independence. But Juan had vanished into the sprawl of East Tulsa, swallowed up by the same streets that had delivered him to the driver's apartment complex just the night before. Detectives brought the driver downtown for questioning. His story was strange, there was no getting around that. A man shows up at his house with a dead body in his car, claiming he just went inside to get a bucket of water. That makes absolutely no sense, Kennedy muttered. But as the investigation progressed, the driver's account would prove surprisingly accurate. Through an interpreter, the driver walked detectives through the previous 24 hours. He'd met Juan just the night before, when the stranger approached him in the parking lot asking for help. He didn't even know Juan's last name. As for the victim, the driver knew him only as El Chino, a nickname. They'd met 6 weeks earlier when the driver bought a computer from him. The computer turned out to be useless, and the driver had been looking for him ever since to get his money back.
So on the day you just happened to be over there again, and you see him, and you confront him about the computer.
After all that time sitting in there talking to him, I still think there was a lot more that he didn't tell us. But it wasn't that the driver was lying, it was that the truth was almost too strange to believe. 2 strangers had climbed into his car on an ordinary afternoon, and one of them had murdered the other for reasons that defied comprehension. With the suspect still at large, detectives turned their attention to identifying the young man in the back seat. They started with the driver's account he'd met the victim at a friend's house 6 weeks earlier. The apartment belonged to a woman who had also let Juan stay the night before. When detectives knocked on her door, she was clearly rattled by their presence. "What happened? We're going to talk to you about that," Kennedy replied. "The guy that you were walking around with killed somebody this afternoon." "That's crazy." She explained that Juan had shown up the night before asking for a place to stay. She'd let him crash at her apartment, but he'd left early that morning with the driver. She didn't know anything else about him, not his last name, not where he came from, not why he'd appeared in the parking lot asking strangers for help. Detectives searched her apartment, hoping to find some trace of Juan, a wallet, an ID, anything that might help them track him down. But Juan wasn't there, and he'd left nothing behind. The search for the victim's identity took them next to a house in the neighborhood where the driver had first met El Chino. A man named Jesus answered the door. When Kennedy showed him the crime scene photo, a difficult image of the victim's face, Jesus recognized him immediately. "Oh man," he said. "You know him?" "Lalo." The victim's name was Lalo. Jesus didn't know his last name, but he knew where Lalo's ex-girlfriend lived. He agreed to take detectives there. The ex-girlfriend confirmed the identification. The young man in the photo was indeed Lalo Ledesma Jr., to be precise. He was 19 years old. He'd been born in Tulsa but moved to Mexico with his family as a child. At 17, he'd returned to Oklahoma to work construction with his uncle. His father lived somewhere in East Tulsa, though she wasn't sure exactly where. "I'm a homicide detective," Kennedy told her gently. "He was murdered yesterday. We're trying to figure out who he was. We didn't have a clue." The news hit her hard. Whatever had happened between them, whatever had ended their relationship, this wasn't the ending anyone deserved. Lalo Ledesma Jr. was 19 years old. He was the youngest of 3 boys. He had come to America seeking opportunity, working hard to send money home to his family in Mexico. And now he was dead, murdered by a stranger, for reasons that no one could explain. 27 hours after Juan fled the crime scene, detectives got the break they'd been hoping for, though it came from the most unexpected source imaginable. A call came into 911 from a convenience store. The caller, an employee, reported that a Hispanic male had approached him with a strange smile on his face. The man had said something in Spanish that made the employee's blood run cold. He said that he killed someone, the caller reported, and that he was going to kill again. When officers arrived at the convenience store, they found Juan waiting calmly. He wasn't trying to hide. He wasn't trying to run. He had a bunch of lighters in his pocket and that same cold sore on his lower lip, the one that had been visible in the surveillance footage from the day before. One of the real big identificators we had on this guy was a giant cold sore on the bottom of his lip, Kennedy noted when he arrived at the scene. And this guy's got that. 18-year-old Juan Guara Vasquez had no prior criminal record. He was young, unknown to law enforcement, a ghost who had materialized in a parking lot, and would now face justice for one of the most brutal murders Tulsa had seen in years. But the question that haunted everyone involved was simple. Why? Why had Juan attacked a stranger with such ferocity? What could possibly have driven him to stab a young man 45 times in the back seat of someone else's car? The formal interrogation took place at Tulsa Police Headquarters. Detectives Kennedy and White sat across from Juan in a small, sterile room with an officer serving as interpreter. Kennedy began carefully, establishing the basics. Through the interpreter, he asked Juan where he was from, how long he'd been in Tulsa. The answers were unremarkable. A young man recently arrived, drifting through the city without roots or connections. Then Kennedy showed Juan a photograph of the driver, the man who owned the Ford Expedition. Juan nodded in recognition. That man gave him a hoodie because it was cold, the interpreter relayed. And did that man give him a ride in his vehicle? Juan's response sent a chill through the room. That person was not in the vehicle when I killed him. There it was. A confession, delivered without hesitation or apparent remorse. Let's get more detailed. Where was the guy he killed located in the vehicle? Juan indicated the back seat. Ask him why he was so mad at this guy. The interpreter relayed the question. Juan's answer was chilling in its simplicity. I killed him because he was bothering. The statement made no sense. Juan didn't know the driver. He'd met him less than 24 hours before the murder. And Lalo hadn't done anything to Juan. They were strangers sharing a ride. Kennedy pushed further. What did he use as a weapon? Juan didn't have a knife on him when he was arrested. The weapon had never been recovered. But his answer revealed something about the savagery of the attack. He said he destroyed his throat. The medical examiner's report would confirm this. Of the 45 stab wounds inflicted on Lalo's body, many were concentrated around his neck. It was an attack designed not just to kill, but to annihilate. Did the guy that he killed do something to him physically before all this occurred? Kennedy asked. Then came perhaps the most disturbing moment of the interrogation. When asked about his actions after the murder, he said he drank blood. The interpreter's words hung in the air. Juan sat calmly, his expression unchanged, as if he'd just mentioned the weather. Kennedy asked Juan how many times he had stabbed his victim. The interpreter relayed Juan's response. He didn't remember. It had happened in a blur, a frenzy that he couldn't fully account for. Ask him where he went after he killed the guy. Juan described wandering the streets of East Tulsa, drifting from place to place, until he ended up at the convenience store where he'd approached the employee and confessed. Does he regret what he did? Juan's answer was strange, almost philosophical. It just came at him. And then, through the interpreter, he's saying, if you have faith, you have everything. And if you don't have faith, you don't have anything. Kennedy nodded slowly. I agree, he said, not agreeing with Juan's actions, but acknowledging the statement in a way that might keep the suspect talking. As the interview wound down, Kennedy stepped out of the room to confer with his partner. If you told me this was going to end up like this, I would have bet against it, White said. He just didn't have anywhere to go. I would have liked to have had a little bit more vivid detail about other things, Kennedy admitted. The confession was clear, but the motive remained murky. Why had Juan killed Lalo? What had triggered such explosive violence? He knows what he did, Kennedy concluded. He even says what I did was bad. White nodded. There'll be a psycho evaluation on him, though. Indeed there would, because whatever had driven Juan Guara Vasquez to murder a stranger in broad daylight, it clearly wasn't rational. It wasn't planned. It was something darker, something that defied easy explanation. With Juan's confession secured, investigators turned to the physical evidence. What they found corroborated the horrific details Juan had provided and added new dimensions to the brutality of the crime. Juan Guara Vasquez was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Lalo Ledesma Jr. Given his confession, the surveillance footage, and the overwhelming physical evidence, the case against him was airtight. But the question of why, the question that had haunted investigators from the beginning, would never be fully answered. Juan's statements about killing because Lalo was bothering someone, his claim that he drank blood, his strange philosophical musings about faith, all pointed to a mind that wasn't operating on the same plane as everyone else's. The psychiatric evaluation that Detective White had predicted would indeed take place, though its findings remained part of the sealed court proceedings. What investigators could say with certainty was this: Juan Guara Vasquez had killed before that day, but perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence was Juan's own behavior in the hours after the murder. He didn't try to flee the city. He didn't try to dispose of evidence or create an alibi. Instead, he wandered the streets of East Tulsa until he walked into a convenience store and, with a smile on his face, told a stranger that he had killed someone and that he was going to kill again. He said he would kill again, and I believe him.
So we don't have to worry about him taking somebody else's life.
16 months after Lalo was murdered, the pain of his loss still reverberates through his family. His father, working to support his wife and remaining sons back in Mexico, struggles daily with the senseless nature of his youngest child's death. The grief is compounded by distance: the father in Tulsa, the rest of the family in Mexico, separated by borders that Lalo had crossed seeking a better life. He came to America to work, to build something, to help his family. Instead, he became the victim of a random act of violence that no one could have predicted or prevented.